The rotor blades of the stolen Apache helicopter cut through the morning air as Dawn Robinson approached the combat zone, knowing that in less than an hour, she'd either be a hero or facing a court-martial. 3 hours earlier, she'd been grounded, banned from flying, told she was too emotional, too unstable to be trusted with military aircraft. But when the radio crackled with news that her husband's unit was trapped behind enemy lines with no way out, Dawn made a choice that would change everything. She walked into the hangar, started up a $30 million attack helicopter that she had no authorization to fly, and launched into the sky on a mission that military command said was impossible. This is the story of how one woman's love and determination proved that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to save lives. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The alarm buzzed at 0500 hours, but Dawn Robinson had been staring at the ceiling of her quarters for the past 2 hours. Outside her window at Forward Operating Base Vanguard, the Italian countryside stretched under a clear morning sky, deceptively peaceful for a region that had become a hotbed of insurgent activity. The sun painted the rolling hills in soft gold, the kind of beautiful morning that made war seem impossible until the first mortars started falling. Dawn sat on the edge of her narrow bunk, running her fingers through her auburn hair, a nervous habit she'd developed since arriving at the base 6 months ago. At 28, she was one of the youngest helicopter pilots in the European theater and certainly one of the most skilled. Her flight records were flawless, her technical knowledge encyclopedic, and her ability to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain around the base was unmatched. But none of that mattered when it came to the missions that counted. She pulled on her flight suit, the fabric still crisp despite months of wear. The routine was always the same: dress, coffee, briefing, disappointment. Dawn had memorized every flight path within a 200-kilometer radius, studied weather patterns obsessively, and maintained her aircraft with a precision that impressed even the veteran mechanics. Her husband Marcus often joked that she loved her helicopter more than she loved him, but Dawn knew it was deeper than that. Flying wasn't just her job. It was the one place where her emotions, her intensity, her refusal to accept limitations became strengths rather than weaknesses. The mess hall was already buzzing with pre-dawn activity when she arrived. Dawn grabbed a cup of coffee and found her usual spot near the window where she could watch the flight line and the helicopters that would soon take off on missions she wouldn't be assigned to. The Apache sat on the tarmac like sleeping predators, their sleek profiles promising power and precision. She'd flown every one of them, knew their individual quirks and capabilities better than anyone on base. "Morning, Robinson," called out Captain Elena Vasquez, sliding into the seat across from her. Elena was one of the few people at the base who treated Dawn as an equal rather than a liability. "Ready for another thrilling day of equipment inspections?" Dawn managed a weak smile. Equipment inspections. That's what her career had been reduced to after the incident 3 weeks ago. She'd gotten emotional during a mission briefing, had raised her voice when she disagreed with a tactical decision that she knew was wrong. The mission had gone ahead as planned, resulted in exactly the problem she'd predicted, but instead of acknowledging her expertise, Command had labeled her as emotionally volatile and grounded her from combat operations. "They're calling it the Rodriguez extraction today," Elena continued, lowering her voice. "Seems like a straightforward recovery mission, but the intel suggests heavier resistance than they're planning for." Dawn's stomach tightened. She'd studied the terrain around the Rodriguez position extensively. The valley was a natural funnel that would channel any approaching aircraft into a kill zone. She tried to bring this up during preliminary discussions, but her input had been dismissed as overthinking. Now Marcus would be flying into that valley as part of the ground support team, and Dawn would be stuck on base counting spare parts. The briefing tent filled with the usual suspects: pilots, crew chiefs, ground commanders, all preparing for another day of operations in a region that had become increasingly hostile. Dawn found her assigned seat near the back, her notebook open to a page that would remain mostly blank since equipment inspections required little tactical planning. Around her, the real pilots discussed flight paths, threat assessments, and contingency plans for missions she could execute better than any of them.
"The Rodriguez extraction is our priority mission," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform. "Intelligence indicates the team is surrounded, but holding their position. We need precision timing and flawless execution." Dawn watched as the familiar names were called for the mission roster. Captain Mitchell would lead the extraction helicopter, Lieutenant Burns would provide air cover, and Sergeant Torres would coordinate ground support. Each name was another reminder that she was considered too unreliable for the work she'd trained her entire life to do. As the briefing continued, Dawn found herself sketching tactical alternatives in her notebook margins. The planned approach was textbook, but predictable. Enemy forces would anticipate it, would have time to prepare countermeasures. There was a better way, a route through the northern canyon that would provide cover and surprise, but bringing it up now would only result in another lecture about staying in her lane. When the briefing ended and the selected crews began their pre-flight preparations, Dawn remained in her seat, watching through the tent opening as the helicopters prepared for departure. Somewhere out there, Marcus was leading his ground unit through hostile territory, depending on air support that would follow a flawed plan because she'd been deemed too emotional to contribute to the mission planning. The irony wasn't lost on her. They called her too emotional, but it was her passion for perfection, her refusal to accept good enough when lives were at stake, that made her the best pilot on the base. Instead of recognizing this as dedication, Command saw it as a character flaw that disqualified her from the missions where that dedication could save lives. Part 2. The Limitation Reveal. The hangar fell quiet as the mission helicopters lifted off into the morning sky, their rotor wash stirring up dust that caught the golden sunlight streaming through the open bay doors. Dawn stood among the support crew, watching the aircraft disappear over the Italian hills, knowing that her husband was out there somewhere, counting on air support that she could have provided better than anyone now airborne. "Robinson," barked Chief Warrant Officer Stevens, approaching with a clipboard and the kind of expression that meant her day was about to get worse. "You're on inventory duty today. New equipment came in yesterday, and I need every piece accounted for and properly cataloged." Dawn nodded curtly, accepting the assignment that had become her professional purgatory. 3 weeks ago, she'd been flying combat missions, leading rescue operations, earning the respect of ground units who knew they could count on her precision and determination. Now she was counting bolts and checking serial numbers while other pilots flew the missions she should have been leading. The hangar's storage area was a maze of crates and shelving units filled with everything from spare rotor components to emergency medical supplies. Dawn worked methodically, her attention to detail serving her well even in this mundane task. But her mind kept wandering to the Rodriguez extraction, to the tactical problems she'd identified, to her husband, Marcus, somewhere in that hostile valley, depending on support that might not be adequate. "Heard you tried to redesign the whole mission plan yesterday," came a voice from behind her. Dawn turned to see Lieutenant Jake Morrison, one of the pilots selected for today's support mission. His tone carried the casual dismissal she'd grown accustomed to, the assumption that her tactical suggestions were emotional overreactions rather than professional assessments. "I identified some potential issues with the approach vector," Dawn replied, keeping her voice level despite the frustration building inside her. "The planned route takes our aircraft through a natural funnel that's perfect for an ambush." Morrison laughed, shaking his head. "See, this is exactly what Colonel Harrison means about you overthinking everything. It's a simple extraction mission, not the Normandy invasion. Sometimes a straightforward approach is the right approach." Dawn set down her clipboard and faced him directly. "Sometimes a straightforward approach gets people killed, Jake. The terrain around Rodriguez's position channels aircraft into predictable patterns. Any competent enemy force will have anticipated our likely routes and prepared accordingly." "And sometimes," he replied, his voice taking on a patronizing edge, "emotional pilots create problems where none exist because they're too wrapped up in worst-case scenarios to see the situation clearly." The word emotional hit Dawn like a physical blow. It had become the catch-all criticism used to dismiss any input she offered, any expertise she tried to share. In a profession where calm decision-making under pressure was paramount, being labeled emotional was career death. It didn't matter that her emotions drove her to check and double-check every detail, what made her study terrain maps until she could navigate them blindfolded, what made her care enough about the people depending on us to question plans that might get them killed. "My emotions," Dawn said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "are what make me check and double-check every detail, what make me study terrain maps until I can navigate them blindfolded, what make me care enough about the people depending on us to question plans that might get them killed." Morrison shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Robinson. But at the end of the day, you're grounded because you can't keep your feelings in check during critical moments. That's not something you can argue your way out of." As he walked away, Dawn felt the familiar burn of injustice that had become her constant companion. She'd been grounded not for any failure in the air, not for any mistake that endangered lives, but for caring too much, for refusing to stay quiet when she saw tactical errors being made. Her passion for perfection had been reframed as emotional instability, her dedication to perfection dismissed as overthinking. The afternoon briefing brought troubling news. Dawn sat in her usual spot at the back of the tent, notebook open to a page that would remain largely empty since she wasn't assigned to any meaningful operations. Around her, the atmosphere was tense as Colonel Harrison updated the assembled personnel on the Rodriguez extraction's complications. "The morning operation encountered unexpected resistance," Harrison announced, his weathered face showing strain. "What intelligence classified as light enemy presence turned out to be a well-coordinated defensive position. We've had to adjust our timeline and approach vectors." Dawn's pen gripped tighter in her hand. Everything she'd tried to warn them about was coming to pass. The predictable southern approach had indeed been anticipated by enemy forces. The extraction team had flown directly into prepared positions, exactly as she'd predicted during the mission planning sessions where her input had been dismissed as overthinking. Lieutenant Morrison, who had mocked her concerns that morning, now sat 3 rows ahead with shoulders tensed and jaw clenched. The confidence he displayed while dismissing her tactical assessments had evaporated in the face of field reality. But would anyone acknowledge that her warnings had been accurate? Dawn already knew the answer. "Robinson," Chief Stevens called out after the briefing dispersed. "Colonel wants to see you in his office at 1500 hours." Dawn's stomach dropped. A direct summons from Harrison usually meant more restrictions, more ways to limit her involvement in operations. She spent the next hour completing equipment maintenance reports, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Perhaps they blamed her somehow for the mission complications, as if her negative attitude had jinxed the operation. Harrison's office felt smaller than usual when she entered precisely at 3 o'clock. The colonel sat behind his desk, her personnel files spread open before him, her service record laid bare like evidence in a trial. 2 other officers flanked his desk, Major Patricia Wong from Personnel and Captain David Mueller from the Inspector General's office. "Specialist Robinson," Harrison began, his tone carrying the weight of administrative authority. "We need to discuss your recent performance and attitude issues that have come to our attention." Dawn straightened in her chair. "Sir, my performance evaluations have been consistently excellent. My flight hours are current, my technical certifications are up to date, and my mission success rate is flawless." "Your technical competences isn't in question," Major Wong interjected, consulting her own set of documents. "However, multiple supervisors have reported concerns about your tendency to challenge established procedures and question tactical decisions made by senior personnel." The words hit Dawn like physical blows. Her dedication to mission success, her refusal to remain silent when she identified potential problems, was being reframed as insubordination. "Ma'am, I've only raised concerns when I believed there were tactical improvements that could save lives or increase mission effectiveness." Captain Mueller leaned forward, his expression stern. "Specialist, the military functions on a clear chain of command and established procedures. When personnel consistently question decisions made by their superiors, it undermines unit cohesion and operational effectiveness." Dawn felt heat rising in her cheeks. Sir, respectfully, this morning's complications during the Rodriguez extraction were precisely the issues I tried to address during mission planning. The southern approach vector was predictable and vulnerable to the kind of defensive positions we encountered. Harrison's face darkened. Are you suggesting that mission complications were the result of poor planning by superior officers? The question was a trap. Answering honestly would be seen as insubordination, but remaining silent meant accepting that her expertise would continue to be ignored while preventable problems occurred in the field. Dawn chose honesty. Sir, I'm suggesting that incorporating input from all qualified personnel, regardless of rank, might improve mission outcomes and reduce casualties. That evening, Dawn sat in her quarters with maps spread across her small desk, studying terrain and flight patterns with an intensity that would have justified her supervisor's concerns about her obsessive tendencies. But this wasn't overthinking. It was preparation for opportunities that might never come, but that she refused to be unprepared for. The detailed topographical maps covered every square kilometer within a 300-kilometer radius of the base. Dawn had acquired them gradually over months, using official channels when possible, but sometimes trading favors with intelligence personnel for access to more specialized reconnaissance data. She'd memorized elevation changes, identified potential landing zones, and marked defensive positions that could threaten aircraft operating in the region. Her unauthorized studies weren't limited to terrain analysis. Dawn had also been quietly accumulating tactical knowledge that extended far beyond her official role as a helicopter pilot. She'd studied communication patterns, learned to read weather conditions that affected aircraft performance, and developed contingency plans for scenarios that command hadn't considered. The knock on her door interrupted her concentration. Dawn quickly gathered the maps and slid them into a footlocker as Elena Vasquez entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of concerned friendship. "Heard about your meeting with Harrison today," Elena said, settling into the room's only chair while Dawn perched on her bunk. Word travels fast around here. Dawn accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the steam as she collected her thoughts. Elena was one of the few people on base who understood her frustrations, who'd seen her competence firsthand and recognized the injustice of her treatment. "They're trying to push me out of aviation entirely, not because I'm incompetent, but because I won't stay quiet when I see problems that could get people killed." Elena nodded, sympathetically. "I've been watching this pattern for months. Every time you identify an issue or suggest an improvement, they label it as emotional overreaction or insubordination. It's like they want pilots who don't think, who just follow orders without question. The worst part is that I was right about the Rodriguez extraction. Everything I warned about happened exactly as I predicted. But instead of acknowledging that my concerns were valid, they're using the complications as further evidence that I'm disruptive. Have you considered requesting a transfer? Maybe a different command structure would appreciate your skills and initiative." Dawn had considered it, but transfer requests took months to process and required approval from her current command. Harrison and his staff had effectively trapped her in a situation where her expertise was ignored while her attempts to contribute were used as evidence against her character. "They've made it clear that my future in aviation depends on accepting limitations I'm not willing to accept. They want me to stop studying beyond my assigned duties, stop questioning tactical decisions, stop caring about mission outcomes beyond my narrow role."
Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. What if the situation changed? What if there was an emergency where your skills became essential? The question hung in the air between them. Dawn had been thinking the same thing, had been preparing for scenarios where her unauthorized knowledge and capabilities might become the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But such situations were hypothetical, and Dawn's actual influence on operations was becoming more limited each day. I've been studying contingency scenarios, not because I expect to be involved, but because I can't help myself. If something happened to the primary pilots, if there was an emergency that required someone with extensive terrain knowledge and tactical planning capability, she trailed off, realizing how her words must sound. Elena studied her carefully, recognizing the dedication that others had misinterpreted as emotional instability. You've been preparing for opportunities that might never come. That's either the most optimistic thing I've ever heard or the most delusional. Dawn smiled grimly. Maybe both. But I'd rather be prepared for opportunities I never get than unprepared for ones I do. After Elena left, Dawn returned to her maps with renewed focus. Her official duties had been reduced to equipment maintenance and logistics support, but her unofficial preparation continued with the same intensity that had always driven her pursuit of excellence. She studied flight patterns until she could navigate them blindfolded, memorized enemy positions until she could anticipate their tactical responses, and planned contingency operations for scenarios that command hadn't considered.
The mess hall buzzed with the kind of subdued conversation that followed difficult missions. Dawn entered during the evening meal, her flight suit replaced by standard fatigues since she was no longer authorized to wear aviation attire. The symbolic demotion wasn't lost on anyone, and she felt eyes tracking her movement as she collected her meal and searched for an isolated table. The Rodriguez extraction had finally concluded successfully, but not without complications that had extended the operation well beyond its planned duration. Dawn had monitored radio communications from the logistics office, listening to reports that confirmed every concern she'd raised during the planning phase. Yet somehow, her accurate predictions had become additional evidence of her problematic attitude. "There she goes again," Dawn heard from a nearby table, the voice belonging to Sergeant Matthews from the maintenance crew. "Probably analyzing everything that went wrong today, getting ready to tell everyone how she would have done it better." Dawn pretended not to hear, focusing on her meal while conversations continued around her. But the comments weren't subtle, and they weren't meant to be. A campaign of whispers had begun, designed to isolate her further and justify the command's decision to limit her role. "I heard she's been studying classified terrain maps without authorization," came another voice, this one belonging to Lieutenant Foster from Intelligence. "Makes you wonder what she's really planning with all that unauthorized research." The accusation made Dawn's blood run cold. Her terrain studies were extensive but not classified, acquired through legitimate channels and personal trading relationships. But the suggestion that she was accessing unauthorized materials planted seeds of suspicion that could grow into serious allegations. Captain Morrison approached her table, his expression a mixture of false concern and barely concealed satisfaction. "Mind if I sit down, Robinson? Wanted to check how you're adjusting to your new assignment." Dawn nodded toward the empty chair, knowing that refusing would be interpreted as further evidence of her poor attitude. Morrison settled across from her with the confidence of someone who'd never had his competence questioned or his career systematically dismantled. "Tough break about the aviation reassignment," Morrison said, his tone suggesting sympathy, while his eyes showed something closer to vindication. "But maybe it's for the best.
Flying combat missions requires a certain kind of mental stability, ability to make decisions without getting emotionally invested in outcomes. Dawn set down her fork carefully, recognizing the trap in Morrison's words. Anything she said in defense of her emotional investment in mission success would be used as evidence of exactly the kind of instability he was describing. "I've always been committed to mission success and the safety of personnel under my care," Dawn replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger building inside her. "See, that's exactly what I mean," Morrison continued, warming to his theme. "You're so committed, so emotionally invested, that you can't accept when your input isn't needed. That's not healthy for unit morale, and it's definitely not healthy for someone who's supposed to make life-and-death decisions in the cockpit." The logic was circular and infuriating. Dawn's dedication was being redefined as obsession, her expertise dismissed as emotional overreaction, her refusal to accept limitations painted as psychological instability. Every strength she possessed was being reframed as a corresponding weakness that disqualified her from the work she'd trained for. "Furthermore," Morrison added, leaning forward conspiratorially, "some people are wondering if your recent behavior might be connected to personal stress. I mean, having your husband deployed in ground operations while you're stuck on base, that's got to create some emotional pressure." Dawn's hands clenched involuntarily at the mention of Marcus. The suggestion that her professional concerns were actually manifestations of personal anxiety was both insulting and dangerous. Once that narrative took hold, every opinion she expressed, every tactical insight she offered, would be dismissed as the emotional response of a worried wife rather than the professional assessment of a qualified pilot. "My personal relationships have never interfered with my professional performance," Dawn stated firmly. "My service record demonstrates consistent excellence across all evaluated categories." "That's true," Morrison agreed, "but your service record doesn't capture your recent attitude problems. The way you've been challenging command decisions, questioning tactical plans, studying materials beyond your assigned duties, it paints a picture of someone who's struggling to accept their role within the unit structure." Dawn realized that Morrison's casual conversation was actually an interrogation designed to elicit responses that could be used to support whatever administrative action command was contemplating. Every word she spoke was being evaluated for signs of the emotional instability they'd already decided she possessed. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Morrison probing for reactions that could be interpreted as defensive, emotional, or insubordinate. Dawn navigated the discussion carefully, but she knew that her careful responses would be seen as calculated rather than professional, further evidence that she was concealing her true feelings rather than addressing her supposed problems. When Morrison finally left, Dawn sat alone at her table, acutely aware of the conversations continuing around her. The whisper campaign had begun in earnest, with her former colleagues dissecting her behavior, her motivations, and her psychological state. Her reputation was being systematically demolished, not through her actions, but through others' interpretations of those actions. Elena appeared beside her table, sliding into the seat Morrison had vacated. "That looked like fun. Let me guess, he was just checking on your emotional adjustment to your new assignment." 3 days after her conversation with Morrison, Dawn received another summons to Colonel Harrison's office. This time, the meeting felt different, more formal, more final. Major Wong was present again, along with Captain Mueller and a new face, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan from the Base Psychological Services Division. Dawn's stomach nodded as she recognized the implications of Brennan's presence. The whisper campaign had escalated to official psychological evaluation, the final step before involuntary removal from aviation duties. She entered the office at precisely the appointed time, her bearing military correct despite the anxiety churning inside her. "Specialist Robinson," Harrison began without preamble,
We've asked you here to discuss concerns that have been raised about your psychological fitness for continued aviation service. The words hit Dawn like physical blows. Psychological fitness. The nuclear option for removing personnel who couldn't be eliminated through normal disciplinary procedures. Once that evaluation began, her career would be effectively over, regardless of the outcome. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan opened a thick file and spread several documents across Harrison's desk. Dawn could see psychological evaluation forms, interview reports, and what appeared to be statements from her colleagues discussing her behavior and attitude. "Specialist," Brennan said in a clinically neutral tone, "multiple supervisory personnel have reported concerns about your emotional regulation, your inability to accept constructive criticism, and your tendency to become fixated on issues outside your assigned responsibilities. These behaviors suggest possible underlying psychological issues that could impair your judgment in high-stress situations." Dawn felt the room spinning slightly as she processed the accusations. Every aspect of her professional dedication was being pathologized, transformed from strengths into symptoms of mental instability. "Ma'am," Dawn began carefully, "I believe there may be misunderstandings about my motivations and behavior. My attention to tactical details and my concerns about mission planning stem from professional dedication, not psychological problems." "That's exactly the kind of response we're concerned about," Major Wong interjected. "Your inability to acknowledge that your behavior has been problematic. Your insistence on reframing criticism as misunderstanding, these are defensive mechanisms that suggest deeper issues." The trap was perfect. Defending herself proved their point about her being defensive. Accepting their characterization would validate their concerns about her psychological state. There was no winning response, no way to navigate the conversation that wouldn't provide them with additional evidence for whatever conclusion they'd already reached. Captain Mueller leaned forward, consulting his own notes. "Furthermore, multiple personnel have reported that you've been conducting unauthorized research into tactical procedures and terrain analysis well beyond your assigned duties. This obsessive focus on materials outside your scope of responsibility suggests an inability to accept your role within the unit structure." Dawn's preparation, her dedication to being ready for any scenario, was being reframed as obsessive behavior, indicating psychological problems. Her greatest professional strengths were being systematically redefined as symptoms of mental illness. "Sir," Dawn said, struggling to keep her voice steady, "studying terrain and tactical procedures makes me more effective at my assigned duties. Understanding the operational environment helps me provide better logistical support and equipment management." Lieutenant Colonel Brennan made notes while Dawn spoke, her expression professionally neutral but somehow ominous. "Specialist, can you explain why you feel compelled to study materials and procedures that extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities?" The question was designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as signs of obsessive behavior or grandiose thinking. Dawn recognized the psychological evaluation techniques being employed, the careful phrasing designed to trap her regardless of how she responded. "I believe that being a good soldier means being prepared for whatever the mission requires," Dawn replied. "In a combat environment, situations can change rapidly, and having broader knowledge helps me serve more effectively." "But don't you think," Brennan pressed, "that your commanding officers are better positioned to determine what knowledge and preparation you need for your assigned role? Your insistence on making these determinations yourself suggests difficulty accepting authority and appropriate boundaries." Dawn realized that the evaluation wasn't actually about her psychological state. It was about her refusal to stay within the narrow confines others had established for her role. Her initiative was being pathologized, her expertise dismissed as evidence of psychological problems. Harrison cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what Dawn suspected was the predetermined outcome of this meeting. Specialist Robinson, based on the concerns raised by your supervisors and the preliminary psychological assessment, we're implementing immediate restrictions on your duties and responsibilities. Dawn's heart pounded as she waited for the specifics of her professional death sentence. Effective immediately, Harrison continued, you're restricted to base facilities and are prohibited from accessing any aircraft or aviation-related equipment. Your duties are limited to administrative support under direct supervision. Additionally, you're required to undergo comprehensive psychological evaluation to determine your fitness for continued military service. The words seemed to echo in the small office. Dawn had been grounded completely, stripped of all meaningful responsibilities, and subjected to psychological evaluation that would likely end her military career. Her competence had been acknowledged, but deemed irrelevant compared to her supposed psychological problems. "Sir," Dawn said quietly, "I request the opportunity to appeal this decision through appropriate channels."
The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 03:47 hours, its wailing cry dragging Dawn from restless sleep in her restricted quarters. She bolted upright, muscle memory from months of emergency responses overriding her groggy confusion. Then reality crashed back. She was grounded, restricted to base, prohibited from participating in any aviation operations. The alarm was for someone else to answer. Dawn threw on her fatigues and stepped outside her quarters, joining the stream of personnel rushing toward the operations center. Despite her restrictions, nobody questioned her presence among the crowd gathering around the command post. In the chaos of an emergency response, her forbidden status was temporarily forgotten. The briefing area buzzed with frantic activity as Colonel Harrison coordinated the response. Dawn positioned herself near the back, close enough to hear, but far enough to avoid immediate notice. The situation unfolding on the tactical display made her blood run cold. At 03:30 hours, Ground Team Delta encountered heavy resistance during a reconnaissance patrol in the Montrose Valley, Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the assembled personnel. They've taken casualties and are pinned down in a defensive position approximately 40 kilometers northeast of base. Dawn's heart hammered against her ribs. Ground Team Delta, Marcus's unit. Her husband was trapped in hostile territory, surrounded by enemy forces, depending on a rescue operation that would need to navigate the same tactical challenges she'd been warning about for months. Initial extraction attempts have been unsuccessful, Harrison continued. The terrain is extremely difficult, and enemy positions are well coordinated. We've lost one helicopter to ground fire, and the remaining aircraft can't establish a secure approach vector to the extraction point. Dawn pushed forward through the crowd, her restriction forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. She could see the tactical display clearly now, showing the valley where Marcus was trapped. It was even worse than the Rodriguez extraction site. A narrow canyon surrounded by elevated positions perfect for ambush, with limited approach vectors and no secure landing zones within reasonable distance of the trapped personnel. "Sir," called out Captain Mitchell, the senior pilot, "the standard approach vectors are completely compromised. Every route we've attempted has been met with concentrated fire from prepared positions. We need alternative options." Dawn's mouth opened before she could stop herself. "Sir, there's a northern route through the Serrano Canyon that could work. It's technically challenging, but it would avoid the prepared defensive positions and provide cover during the approach." The briefing area fell silent. Every head turned toward Dawn, some showing surprise, others displaying the familiar mixture of irritation and dismissal. Harrison's face darkened with anger at her unauthorized input. "Specialist Robinson," Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You are not authorized to participate in tactical planning. Return to your quarters immediately." "Sir, with respect," Dawn pressed, knowing she was crossing another line she couldn't uncross. I've studied that terrain extensively. The Northern Canyon approach is narrow but navigable, and it would bring aircraft in below enemy sight lines until the final approach to the extraction point. Major Wong stepped forward, her expression a mixture of disbelief and professional outrage. Specialist, you are under psychological evaluation and explicitly prohibited from involvement in operational planning. Your presence here is already a violation of direct orders. Dawn felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but this time the stakes were different. This wasn't about her career or her professional reputation. Marcus was trapped in that valley, along with 8 other members of his unit, depending on a rescue operation that would need to navigate the same tactical challenges she'd been warning about for months. "Ma'am," Dawn said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, "my husband is in that valley. I have extensive knowledge of the terrain and tactical alternatives that could save lives. Whether or not you consider me psychologically fit for service, the information I have could make the difference between mission success and watching those men die." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Dawn could see calculations running behind Harrison's eyes, weighing her unauthorized knowledge against her restricted status, her tactical expertise against her supposed psychological problems. Captain Mueller spoke out from beside the tactical display. "Sir, we've exhausted our conventional options. The enemy has anticipated every standard approach vector we could use. Unless we develop alternative strategies, extraction may not be possible before the enemy position becomes untenable for our personnel." Dawn seized the opening. The Serrano Canyon approach would require precise navigation and advanced flying skills, but it's technically feasible. The canyon walls provide cover until the final 3 kilometers, where aircraft would have to transition to nap-of-the-earth flight to avoid detection.
Dawn returned to her quarters with Harrison's final words echoing in her mind. "We'll continue working with authorized personnel to develop extraction alternatives." The dismissal was complete and final, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through her restricted quarters window, she could see personnel rushing between buildings, the urgent activity of a base responding to crisis. Her radio, officially disabled as part of her restrictions, crackled with emergency communications she'd quietly restored using technical knowledge that extended beyond her assigned duties. The intercepts painted a grim picture of the extraction attempts. "Base, this is Rescue 2, came Mitchell's strained voice over the static. "We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions, unable to establish approach vector to Delta Team's location, requesting immediate tactical support." Dawn's hands clenched as she listened to the communications, revealing exactly the problems she'd predicted. The standard approaches were failing, precisely as her unauthorized terrain studies had suggested they would. Enemy forces had positioned themselves to cover every conventional route, turning the valley into a killing field for any aircraft attempting rescue operations. "Base, this is Rescue 2. Base," came Harrison's response. "Pull back to safe distance and reassess. We're working on alternative options." But Dawn knew there were no alternative options within conventional military thinking. She'd spent months studying this exact scenario, had identified the problems and solutions that Command was discovering only now, when it was too late to develop proper responses through official channels. A soft knock interrupted her monitoring. Elena entered without waiting for permission, her face showing the strain of watching events unfold without being able to influence them. "They're not going to make it, are they?" Elena asked quietly, settling beside Dawn's desk where the unauthorized radio continued crackling with increasingly desperate communications. Dawn shook her head, the weight of certainty heavy in her chest. "The valley is a tactical nightmare for conventional extraction. Every standard approach vector is covered by prepared positions. Without alternative strategies, they're just sending aircraft into predetermined kill zones." "And your alternative strategy?" Elena prompted, though her expression suggested she already knew what Dawn was thinking.
The Serrano Canyon route would work, Dawn replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was considering. It's technically challenging, requires extensive terrain knowledge and advanced flying skills, but it's doable. The canyon provides cover until the final approach, where surprise and speed could overcome the defensive positions. Elena studied Dawn's face, reading the determination that had been building since the morning's briefing. "You're thinking about doing something that can't be undone, aren't you?" Dawn didn't answer directly, but her silence was confirmation enough. They both knew that official channels had been exhausted, that command had rejected her input and prohibited her from participating in the rescue operation. Marcus and his unit were going to die unless someone acted outside the constraints of military protocol. The radio crackled with another update that made Dawn's decision feel inevitable. "Base, Delta Team," came a voice she'd recognized as Marcus's communications specialist. "We've got 3 KIA and 5 wounded. Enemy positions are coordinating for final assault on our location. Estimate we have less than 2 hours before position becomes untenable." Dawn's breath caught in her throat. 3 dead, 5 wounded, and less than 2 hours before the enemy overran Marcus's position. The rescue operation that should have saved them was failing because command couldn't adapt to tactical realities that extended beyond their conventional thinking. Elena reached across the desk and placed her hand on Dawn's arm. "If you're considering what I think you're considering, you need to understand that there's no coming back from it. Whatever you do in the next few hours will define the rest of your life." Dawn nodded, understanding the stakes completely. Unauthorized use of military aircraft is a court-martial offense that would end her career and likely result in prison time. But the alternative was watching her husband and his unit die while she sat in restricted quarters, forbidden from using the knowledge and skills that could save them. "They've made it clear that my career is already over," Dawn said quietly. "The psychological evaluation, the restrictions, the systematic destruction of my reputation. I'm finished in military aviation, regardless of what happens next. The only question is whether I go down having tried everything possible to save the people who matter most." The radio interrupted their conversation with an update that made Dawn's decision feel inevitable. "All units, base," came Harrison's voice, new tension. "Intelligence indicates reinforcements are moving toward Delta Team's position. Timeline for extraction is now critical. We need immediate solutions or we'll lose the entire unit." Dawn stood and moved to her footlocker, retrieving the detailed maps and tactical plans that she'd been developing for months. The Serrano Canyon route was marked in red, with approach vectors, timing calculations, and contingency plans that represented her unauthorized preparation for exactly this scenario. "Dawn," Elena said softly, recognizing the finality in her movements. "You're absolutely certain about this. Once you walk out that door, once you make this choice, everything changes."
Dawn waited until 0200 hours, when the base settled into its quietest period between the late shift and early morning watch change. The emergency operations continued, but most non-essential personnel were either sleeping or focused on authorized activities. It was the perfect window for unauthorized movement. She'd spent the previous hours finalizing her mission plan with the same obsessive attention to detail that had gotten her labeled as psychologically unstable. Every aspect of the unauthorized operation was calculated and prepared. Flight route, timing, fuel requirements, emergency procedures, and contingency plans that extended well beyond what official mission planning typically considered. The flight gear felt familiar, despite months of being prohibited from wearing it. Dawn adjusted her helmet and checked her equipment with the muscle memory of hundreds of previous flights. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been deemed unfit to wear this gear through official channels, but her unauthorized mission required capabilities that her restrictions had been designed to deny. Her movement toward the flight line required careful navigation through base security protocols she'd studied extensively during her months of forced inactivity. Dawn used maintenance routes and blind spots in surveillance coverage,
applying knowledge she'd accumulated through observation and technical expertise that extended beyond her official duties. The hangar housing the Apache helicopters stood like a cathedral in the pre-dawn darkness, its massive doors closed but not locked during active operations. Dawn slipped inside through a personnel entrance, her presence justified by the general base alert that had everyone moving with emergency purpose. The Apache AH-64D sat in the center of the hangar like a sleeping predator, its twin-engine configuration and advanced avionics representing the pinnacle of attack helicopter technology. Dawn had flown this specific aircraft dozens of times during her authorized service, knew its individual characteristics and capabilities better than any other pilot on base. She began her pre-flight inspection with professional thoroughness, checking systems and components with the same attention to detail that had always defined her approach to aviation. The irony was bitter. She was more prepared for this mission than most authorized operations, having spent months developing the tactical knowledge and technical skills required for success. The Apache's systems came online with familiar efficiency as Dawn worked through startup procedures. Each switch activation and system check brought her closer to the point of no return, but also closer to the possibility of saving Marcus and his unit. Her months of unauthorized preparation crystallized into focused determination as the helicopter's engines spun up to operating speed. "This is unauthorized aircraft movement in Hangar 7, crackled a voice over base communications. "Security, respond immediately." Dawn's heart hammered as she realized her theft had been discovered earlier than expected. She had perhaps 5 minutes before security forces arrived in sufficient numbers to prevent her departure. The mission timeline compressed dramatically, requiring immediate action rather than the careful, methodical approach she'd planned. She lifted the Apache from the hangar floor with practiced precision, the aircraft responding to her control inputs with the familiarity of a well-known partnership. Through the cockpit canopy, she could see base personnel running toward the hangar, their movements urgent but too late to prevent her escape. "All units, unauthorized aircraft departure from Base Vanguard," Harrison's voice crackled over emergency frequencies. "Apache 27 taking off without clearance. All personnel maintain safe distance and do not interfere with aircraft movement." Dawn switched off base communication frequencies and activated her personal navigation system following the route she'd memorized through months of unauthorized study. The Serrano Canyon approach required precise timing and navigation that pushed her technical skills to their limits, but she'd prepared for exactly this scenario. The Italian countryside passed beneath the Apache's belly as Dawn flew north toward the trapped ground unit. Her unauthorized radio intercepts continued providing updates on Delta Team's deteriorating situation, confirming that official rescue attempts had been suspended due to insurmountable tactical obstacles. "Base, Delta Team," Marcus's voice crackled over the emergency frequency. "Enemy forces are preparing final assault on our position. We estimate 15 minutes before position is overrun. If extraction is coming, it needs to happen now." 15 minutes. Dawn checked her navigation display and calculated arrival times. The Serrano Canyon route would bring her to the extraction point in approximately 12 minutes, providing a narrow window for rescue operations. Everything depended on the tactical approach she'd developed through months of unauthorized preparation.
The formal hearing convened 3 days after Dawn's unauthorized rescue mission, held in the base's primary briefing room with a panel of officers that included Colonel Harrison, Major Wong, Captain Mueller, and 2 investigators from higher command. Dawn entered wearing dress uniform, her bearing military correct despite the charges that could end her career and result in prison time. The hearing room buzzed with tension as personnel who had participated in the original rescue attempts prepared to testify about the tactical situation that had led to Dawn's unauthorized action. She could see familiar faces among the witnesses: Mitchell, Morrison, Elena, and others who had been present during the failed official operations.
Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan from Psychological Services sat at a separate table, surrounded by evaluation reports and personality assessments that had been used to justify Dawn's exclusion from meaningful duties. Her presence suggested that the hearing would examine not only Dawn's unauthorized actions, but also the psychological evaluations that had constrained her participation in official operations. Colonel Harrison opened the proceedings with formal language that established the serious nature of the charges against Dawn. This hearing will examine the unauthorized actions of Specialist Dawn Robinson and determine appropriate disciplinary measures for violations of military law and regulations. Dawn stood as the charges were read: unauthorized use of military equipment, violation of direct orders, theft of government property, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and willful disobedience of superior authority. Each charge carried potential penalties that could include dismissal from service, financial restitution, and imprisonment. Specialist Robinson, Harrison continued, how do you plead to these charges? Dawn had prepared for this moment during her 3 days in confinement. Sir, I plead guilty to the unauthorized actions described in the charges. However, I maintain that these actions were necessary to save lives that official operations could not protect. The plea created immediate tension in the hearing room. Dawn had admitted guilt while simultaneously asserting justification, a legal position that would require the panel to examine both her violations and the circumstances that had motivated them. Captain Mitchell was called as the first witness, his testimony establishing the tactical situation that had preceded Dawn's unauthorized mission. The enemy had established defensive positions that covered all standard approach vectors, Mitchell reported. Multiple extraction attempts were unsuccessful due to concentrated fire from prepared positions. Morrison followed Mitchell's testimony, describing the failed rescue attempts and the tactical constraints that had prevented official operations from reaching Delta Team. We exhausted all conventional options, Morrison admitted. The terrain and enemy positioning made successful extraction impossible using standard procedures. Dawn listened as her former colleagues documented the tactical problems she had identified months earlier, the same concerns that had been dismissed as overthinking when she'd raised them during official planning sessions. The irony was bitter. Her unauthorized preparation had identified solutions to problems that official channels had only discovered during crisis situations. Elena took the witness stand with documents that detailed Dawn's extensive unauthorized preparation. Specialist Robinson had been studying tactical alternatives for high-risk scenarios for months, Elena testified. Her analysis included detailed terrain studies and contingency planning that extended well beyond her assigned duties. The revelation that Dawn's unauthorized studies had anticipated and solved the tactical challenges that defeated official operations created visible discomfort among the panel members. Her obsessive preparation, dismissed as evidence of psychological problems, had proven essential for mission success. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan was called to explain the psychological evaluations that had led to Dawn's restrictions. Specialist Robinson displayed patterns of behavior that suggested difficulty accepting appropriate boundaries and authority structures. Her tendency to study materials beyond her assigned role and question tactical decisions indicated potential psychological issues. Dawn's defense counsel, Major Peters, challenged Brennan's assessment with pointed questions. Dr. Brennan, did Specialist Robinson's unauthorized studies prove accurate in predicting the tactical challenges that defeated official rescue attempts? Brennan's response was careful but revealing. The accuracy of her tactical analysis doesn't negate concerns about her psychological fitness for following orders and accepting appropriate limitations. The exchange highlighted the fundamental tension underlying Dawn's case. Her capabilities were acknowledged but deemed problematic because they challenged established hierarchy and role definitions. Her expertise was simultaneously essential and unacceptable within military structure. Marcus testified about the rescue operation itself, describing Dawn's tactical competence and the precision of her execution under combat conditions. Specialist Robinson demonstrated exceptional flying skills and tactical awareness during the extraction. Her approach through Serrano Canyon was technically demanding, but perfectly executed.
6 weeks after the hearing, Dawn stood in the office of Brigadier General Patricia Martinez at European Command Headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany. The summons had come unexpectedly, interrupting her confinement while higher command reviewed her case and its broader implications for military structure and individual initiative. General Martinez was a helicopter pilot herself, someone who had navigated the challenges of military aviation as a woman and risen to senior command through competence and determination. Her office displayed the awards and recognition of a career built on exactly the kind of excellence that Dawn had been prevented from demonstrating through official channels. "Specialist Robinson," Martinez began, consulting a file that Dawn recognized as containing her complete service record, psychological evaluations, and detailed analysis of her unauthorized rescue mission. "Your case has generated considerable discussion at the highest levels of command." Dawn remained at attention while Martinez reviewed documents that would determine her future. The weeks of uncertainty had been difficult, but they had also provided time to reflect on the choice she'd made and its consequences for both her individual career and broader questions about military effectiveness. "The unauthorized nature of your actions cannot be overlooked," Martinez continued. "Military discipline depends on personnel following proper authority and established procedures. Your decision to act outside these constraints challenges fundamental aspects of military order." Dawn had expected this emphasis on discipline and authority, having heard similar themes throughout her hearing and subsequent proceedings. But Martinez's tone suggested that her analysis extended beyond simple rule enforcement to encompass broader questions about institutional effectiveness. "However," Martinez said, looking up from the file to meet Dawn's eyes directly, "your unauthorized operation demonstrated capabilities that official channels had failed to recognize or utilize. The tactical analysis you conducted, the preparation you completed, and the mission you executed all exceeded the performance of authorized operations." The acknowledgement carried weight that Dawn had never received from her immediate command structure. Martinez was recognizing not only the success of her unauthorized mission, but also the systematic failure of official procedures to utilize her expertise effectively. "After extensive review and consultation with multiple command levels," Martinez announced, "I'm offering you a choice that reflects both the seriousness of your violations and the extraordinary value of your demonstrated capabilities." Dawn's heart pounded as she waited for options that would define her future military service. Option 1. Accept a general discharge with time served and forfeiture of benefits, acknowledging your violations while recognizing the exceptional circumstances of your actions. The option represented professional death with minimal honor, an end to her military career that acknowledged her competence while punishing her methods. Option 2. Accept a reassignment to the Special Operations Aviation Regiment, where your tactical analysis capabilities and individual initiative can be properly utilized under appropriate command structure. Dawn struggled to process the second option. Special operations represented the pinnacle of military aviation, the units where individual expertise and initiative were valued rather than constrained. It was an opportunity to serve at the highest levels of military capability. "Ma'am," she managed, "I'm honored by the reassignment opportunity, but I need to understand how my previous restrictions and psychological evaluations would affect my service in special operations." Dawn considered her response carefully, understanding that her answer would influence how these young pilots approach their professional development and individual growth. "You prepare for opportunities that might never come. You study beyond your assigned duties, develop capabilities that exceed normal requirements, and refuse to accept that limitations imposed by others define what you can actually accomplish. Most importantly, you remember that rules exist to serve mission success, not to prevent it." The briefing concluded with mission assignments that would test every skill Dawn had developed through her unauthorized preparation and official training. As her team prepared for deployment, Dawn reflected on the transformation that had brought her from excluded logistics specialist to special operations captain.
Her unauthorized rescue had proven that sometimes the most valuable capabilities exist outside established structures, that individual initiative can achieve objectives that institutional procedures cannot accommodate, and that the willingness to risk everything for the right reasons can transform both individual careers and broader organizational understanding. The Apache helicopter that had enabled her vindication still served at the Italian base, now maintained by personnel who understood that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that aren't officially authorized until after they succeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.